Well, hello there, watching the press preview. A first look at what is on the front pages. Time then to see what is making the headlines with the I columnist, Ian Dunt, and the Telegraph's assistant comment editor, Olivia Utley. Great to see both of you staying with us right through until just before midnight. So to the front pages, let's take a look, shall we? Starting with the Financial Times, which leads with the US government's banning of Russian oil imports and also mentions the UK's decision to do the same. The Guardian calls that news a blow to Putin. The Metro reacting to the speech given to the House of Commons by the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky with the headline, "Hear, hear, hero." The Eye quoting from that address, "We will fight in the forests and on the streets." That is also the main story for the Mail. Same headline, "We will fight until the end," they say. And the Mirror too, "We will never surrender." The Telegraph leads with the offer from Poland to help Ukraine with MiG fighters to tackle the Russian assault from the air. While the Star has an interview with Ukrainian former boxing star Vladimir Klitschko on the front line defending his country in what he calls the biggest fight of his life. While the Sun has the story of an unnamed 19-year-old Coldstream Guardsman who the paper is choosing not to name but has reportedly gone AWOL in order to fight in Ukraine. Well, a quick reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out those front pages while you watch us. So let's return then to our guests for now. Joined by Ian Dunt and Olivia Utley. Welcome to both of you. So should we start with this historic occasion, Ian, of the President of Ukraine addressing the House of Commons to multiple rounds of applause?
Yeah, standing ovation at the start, standing ovation at the end, as we would expect, given the same was handed out to the Ukrainian ambassador recently. This is the third sort of major, I suppose, foreign speech that he's done by Zoom. He's done one in the US, done one to Europe, he's now done one here. It's quite hard, I think, when the way that we were forced to watch it and the way that MPs were forced to watch it is, of course, with his voice being sort of dubbed over by someone translating it. And that takes away quite a lot of the strength of the manner in which he speaks, this sort of softly spoken, kind of almost fraternal leadership quality that he emits. So you don't quite get the full sort of strength of his manner, of his charisma, and of the things that he manages to communicate very effectively when listening to it that way. But even then, you saw the intelligence of the speech, you saw the emotional intelligence, as well as the political intelligence of sort of echoing Churchill's "Fight them on the beaches" speech for the British Parliament. It was still good, strong, rousing stuff.
Yes, and that's certainly been picked up by the Eye. We will fight in the forests and on the streets, on the shores. We will not lose. That Churchillian element of it. He knew his audience, and the audience was receptive, wasn't it, Olivia?
Absolutely. And I think what Ian was saying there about the emotional intelligence is very important. And, you know, it's sometimes easy to forget, although we have heard it a lot in recent days, that Zelensky is such an unusual figure. The way he rose through politics is unique. He was an actor who played a president in a drama and then became the president himself. And he wasn't really considered a serious figure. But actually, the sort of charisma that you get as an actor, that emotional intelligence, that the way he communicates with people, the way he's got the people behind him, is exactly what Ukraine needs in this hour of need. So they've got the sort of perfect president for the hour.
Meanwhile, economically, a really big news day. Let's go to The Guardian, one of a number of newspapers that's decided to lead on the hydrocarbons, which is the way the Prime Minister sometimes chooses to describe the parts that we buy in from Russia, the oil, the gas, and so on. And some big, again, unified decisions from various nations, including the US, the UK, and the European Union, which significantly has decided to cut back 2/3 of its reliance on Russian gas by the end of this year, which will be, very difficult to stomach for some nations, Ian.
Extremely difficult. This is actually quite a dangerous area that we're stepping into in terms of the unity of the Western response, right? We looked last week, look at the moves, for instance, to basically freeze Russia's foreign reserves. Now, one of the reasons, that was the most significant act of economic warfare that we've seen in our lifetime against a major economy. We've seen similar against Iran, but against a major economy, we haven't seen anything like that before. Now, that was possible partly because they sidestepped the energy issue. You know, the US is not reliant on Russian energy. The UK is not reliant. I mean, small amounts, but nothing that it can't live without. Europe is. I mean, different countries to different degrees, but Europe is. So the second that you start talking about energy, you run that risk of the fracture in the Western alliance. And also we're forcing the EU into a position where it has to maintain its internal coherence in its response. Now, in a slightly divergent way, we're moving that way. Really tough talk from the US, quite tough talk from the UK, and impressive talk from Europe, but, you know, not to the same degree by any stretch, because simply logistically, it is impossible to do. So look, it is a big, big, big move, but it does present threats to the way that that the West might be able to stay united in its response to Putin.
Well, you say that, but the US gets no gas from Russia and only 7% of its oil, and is an energy exporter, as we heard from Joe Biden today. In Britain, The Guardian is reporting 4% of gas and 8% of oil comes from Russia, although some more, I think, via European markets. And the EU sources about 40% of its gas from Russia and 27% of its oil as well. So that is the big impact. The FT also going with this, markets rattled by push for Russian crude ban as refugee crisis mounts, they say. And part of this is Shell too, isn't it, Olivia? A couple of days ago, the Ukrainian foreign minister tweeted that he'd heard that Shell had discreetly bought some Russian oil. One question to Shell, he said, doesn't Russian oil smell Ukrainian blood for you? And it's very emotive, isn't it, this, the pressure that's being put on individual companies. We're seeing a whole raft more of companies now pulling out and closing their operations in Russia.
It's very interesting, yeah, and Shell has obviously reacted very quickly to that. But then we've also got, which I think we might be talking about in more detail later, but McDonald's pulling out of Russia, and now there are going to be all sorts of corporates who feel the need to follow suit. So I think we were expecting a sort of raft of sanctions from government, but I think what we weren't quite expecting was this completely separate, independent response from corporates, which actually may have more of an effect than those government sanctions. If you think of the people in Russia living their ordinary lives, not having the McDonald's down the road will have a big effect. And you could see Putin being generally kind of undermined, fundamentally undermined by ordinary Russians who are really feeling the pinch, not necessarily from Western governments, but from Western companies putting on their own sanctions, in effect.
Absolutely. Coca-Cola too, PepsiCo thinking about it. We might as well talk about that now while we're on it. It's in the Financial Times, isn't it? And the difficulty really is how companies decide to continue to operate in Russia, given the groundswell of opinion about this, Ian.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think this is happening because companies have suddenly found their moral core. They're taking serious losses. I mean, you look at what BP and Shell do. These are serious, serious losses. McDonald's the same. Danone, you know, just is holding out at the moment. I don't know how much longer it will be able to hold out. They're doing this because the public are putting pressure on them. Like, I mean, it's hard to think of another period where we've seen such effective public pressure, just this pent-up outrage, this appalled moral sense of what Russia has done, making changes. And that's been the way all the way through. I mean, you look at the reaction in sport when it comes to FIFA, look at the reaction with Eurovision. These guys are not making these decisions because they want to. They're doing it because they're scared of the consequences of not making the decision. And it has a significant impact. I mean, we talk it down as if it's small, as if it's culture a lot of the time. I mean, I agree. I don't think it's a small thing at all. I think it's a major, major deal for people. If you can't get Apple, if you can't get Netflix, if you can't get McDonald's, the things that the Russian middle classes like, that make life luxurious and enjoyable, are the same things that the British middle classes like. And you take that away from them, and suddenly you get a more tense and more difficult and more volatile political situation than you had beforehand.
Well, 847 restaurants in Russia going, most of which are company-owned. Starbucks is also suspending all business activity in Russia, including shipment of its products and cafes run by a licence. Unilever too. I mean, we've talked before about, you know, Russia effectively being cancelled. Is that what this appears? And if so, you know, what does it leave Russia as after all of this, Olivia?
I think the sort of difficulty is, yes, it definitely does feel as though Russia's being cancelled or sanctioned or however you want to put it. But I think the question is whether the Russian people see it as an attack from Putin, whether they see it as Putin's fault, whether they see Western countries as intervening here because their president has gone mad and they start to turn against Putin, or whether they see it as the West is ganging up on Russia, is bullying Russia, and it sort of reawakens anti-Western sentiment in Russia. I think McDonald's is a particularly interesting case because, as the FT points out on its front page, McDonald's in Russia was a sort of big post-Soviet symbol, sort of sign of consumerist, capitalist, Western ideals coming into Russia. And with that gone, it's quite a big symbol. So I think just the question is now how the Russian people respond to it. Whose fault do they see it as? Will they turn against their president, or will they just blame the West?
Let's move on to the refugee crisis, and finally, a humanitarian corridor worked out of the city of Sumy. Critically, many foreign students had been trapped at universities in Sumy, including Indian and Chinese students. Critical, you might think, for a weather vane of how they feel about this to President Putin. So 5,000 managed to escape Sumy, 1,700 foreign students. Is it right to be cynical about that, do you think, that the foreign students were prioritised, do you think, by Russia, Ian?
We don't have a basis to come to that sort of conclusion at the moment. We should also add that across Ukraine, foreign students, especially people that aren't white, especially people from Indian subcontinent, especially black people, have suffered some quite appalling acts of racism in Ukraine, often on the border with Poland. It's been a difficult, tough time for them at the moment. At the moment, what we mostly think is anyone that can get out, that manages to get out, that is a good thing. And our only hope really should be that Britain was doing a better job in pulling its weight and helping them and not leaving it to predominantly Eastern Europeans and some other Western European states.
Well, some reports tonight that there will be coaches at Calais to take people to some of these areas where you need to do this biometric testing to get to the UK. So we wait and watch that. The Metro again talking about the refugee crisis set to outpace the fall of Afghanistan. More than 2 million Ukrainians have now fled the Russian invasion. 2 million there, as you can see, without a home. I mean, this is an extraordinary, enormous job, isn't it, for all those neighbours of Ukraine to now deal with and accommodate these refugees, Olivia?
Absolutely. And what Britain's role in this crisis is going to come under a big spotlight now. And that there's a legitimate argument, I think, in the UK that quite a lot of Ukrainians want to be housed in neighbouring countries because they're not migrants, they're refugees. They want to sit out this crisis and go home as soon as it's safe for them to do so. But on the other hand, it does sort of feel as though the UK government to be asking refugees for the 8 forms of identification or whatever it is when they come into the UK seems absolutely absurd. And it does seem to speak of a Home Office in a very precarious situation. It was quite clear we did have a lot of preparation for this to happen. We knew that there were Russian troops gathering on the border. So why the UK hasn't updated its refugee housing programme does seem to be quite strange. And I think we are going to come under a lot more forensic analysis on that over the coming weeks.
Olivia Utley and Ian Dunt, thank you both very much indeed. For now, they'll be back at 11 for more news. To the weather, though, now.